Hello, everybody. I would say welcome back, but I guess I've been the only one that's been missing. So I'm not feeling good at all, but I told you I would be uploading these videos again, so that's what I'm doing. I'm going to go straight through from chapter 6 through 9. I am not going to be editing this video or whatever. We just gonna get a rough cut. So I apologize in advance if this video seems crazy, if I sound crazy. We just gonna push through today. So starting from chapter 6, they talked about pregnancy. The title of chapter 6 is Pre-Pregnancy and Prenatal Issues. Some of the things that caught my eye in chapter 6 was access to health care and Planned Parenthood. One of the things that I remember as a young female teenager in the city of St. Louis was that we had a Planned Parenthood. And honestly, Planned Parenthood probably saved my life. Planned Parenthood was a step up from going down to the county or the city health department. It wasn't as embarrassing. It was a hell of a lot cleaner. And the people there were nicer. But I remember vividly getting in some situations in which I could not tell my parents. So where did I go? I went to the local Planned Parenthood. Planned Parenthood offered a wide variety of services. They offered birth control. They offered STD counseling, testing. They offered abortions. They offered counseling. They offered just general female and male reproductive health checkups. Planned Parenthood was, in my eyes, and still is, awesome. And it's unfortunate that we do not have more Planned Parenthoods in the area. I know that abortion is very much a controversial subject, and I understand that many people just see Planned Parenthood as an abortion clinic, but it's not. It offers a wide variety of services to the no income to low income. Many of their services are on a scale. So if you have no income, you would pretty much be paying nothing or a very, very reduced rate. Planned Parenthood, in my eyes, was just like any clinic for young women who are out there going through life. A lot of people, like I stated again, are against Planned Parenthood because they associate it with abortions. But what if Planned Parenthood was for that teenager who needed birth control and couldn't tell their mom, or who didn't have a mom and was emancipated and was out here going through life alone? Or what about that young adult woman who's in college that didn't have health insurance? You have to remember that health insurance, that students in college just got health insurance mandated to them. I want to say during the Obama era, health insurance went up to the age of 24 or 25, where the parents can still carry you on their health insurance. That wasn't a guarantee when I was an undergrad. And you were lucky if your institution that you went to had a clinic. And even still, you had to pay for that out of pocket. So in my eyes, Planned Parenthood was a great place for those who fell in between the cracks. Think about access to care now. Now that 45, I believe, is in office, one of their main missions was to roll back all of what is known as Obamacare, but it's really the Affordable Care Act. And one of the things that the Affordable Care Act allowed was low-income individuals and those individuals who fell in between the cracks to obtain health insurance through the health insurance market. Now, there's a whole lot of people who said that their health insurance went up, and it probably did. The Affordable Care Act, or Obamacare, was not the best, but it was better than what we had. So most definitely, going back to the Planned Parenthood thing, I think that it was a great benefit for those who had access to it, because it allowed them to bridge the gap or come up out of that trap or that crack that they fell into without being insured or not insured enough. Environmental issues. It talked about environmental issues a little bit. One of the things that I think about when it comes to environmental issues, and also when reading some of your discussion board entries, was those individuals who came from either very strict parenting, or the households that were very religious based, or those rebellious teenagers who had a lot of peer pressure, or were out there trying to figure out life for themselves. Those, in my eyes, are environmental issues, which leads me right back to Planned Parenthood, and why clinics like Planned Parenthood were beneficial. It also helped individuals who were pregnant and needed prenatal care. I know the clinic in St. Louis gave prenatal care up to a certain point. So yeah, that's what I have to say about chapter 6. Chapter 7 jumps into gender identity. So chapter 7 talked about a whole lot of stuff. Gender identity was not the only thing that it talked about. But the thing that popped out in my mind was gender identity. So why am I an advocate about when it comes to gender identity? Well, for a very long time, it's been a taboo subject. You're either heterosexual or you were gay and lesbian. Those pretty much were the two. And the only right thing to be for a very long time was heterosexual. A lot of people who come from very religious homes or backgrounds will tell you that they were raised to believe that, a man marries a woman, and that's the only marriage there is, and anything else is taboo or sin-worthy. Well, I was not raised that way. I was raised in the church, but I have an uncle. My uncle's not really an uncle. My uncle's more so my aunt in certain settings. But most definitely, my uncle was very different, and he was very different in a time that it could have gotten him killed. Actually, he's my great uncle. So it wasn't my mother's brother, but my grandfather's brother. And so because of who he was, he had to leave this small town in Mississippi and go north, pretty much to save his life and to live a lifestyle that he was comfortable with. So why is that such an issue? Or, well, let me backstep because I completely lost my thought. But gender identity is one of those things that I don't think in the wider society it should be an issue. I don't believe or think that it should be something that we should be having. No, let me back up. Because I'm telling you more of my opinion instead of being neutral. It's one of those things where I look at it as this. Who am I to say what is right and what is wrong? As a social worker, as a person who is giving my life to this career field who believes very passionately about helping people, who am I to say that someone's lifestyle is right or wrong? Who am I to say that a young child cannot determine what is right or what is wrong for their body? Who am I to determine that? Who am I to say that's wrong? Who am I to tell someone that they're going to hell for what they believe in? Who am I? As a person and a helping professional, because I realize all of you guys are not going to be social workers, how are you going to cast out a person or a society when you are there to be helping them? How are you going to do that? Who are you to make that judgment? I'm not saying that you have to say that it's right or you have to believe that it's wrong, but who are you to push your opinion on someone else? Who are you to do that? That is not our place, simply put. So when we come across individuals that are different from us, instead of being negative, how about we be open-minded and positive about it? How about we try to look for more understanding or try to be in a place of receiving education? So, case in point, when I was reading some of your discussion boards, a lot of people touched on military, transgenders in the military. And a lot of people said, well, they were confused because they didn't know about how those transgenders, quote unquote, would impact their military duty. My question is, did you Google it? Did you read the policies? Probably not. I know for a fact that these policies are on the internet. Why? Because I had to teach a lot of these policies when I worked for the Navy, because the policy had rolled out and somehow, well, the XO asked me to do some training on it. So for those that don't know, how it works is this. It's not an easy situation. It's not easy for someone to come into the military, number one, and then number two, identify to their colleagues in the administration and medical that they want to be transgender, that they want to change their sex assignment. It's actually very, very difficult to do. It's a lot of policies, it's a lot of tests that are in place, it's a lot of people who have to check the box to say that this person can go forward. It's a lot of testing, it's a lot of counseling. It takes years to do it. But even when it's done, it cannot happen in a cycle of someone who is, quote unquote, going downrange or deploying. A person who actually gets to the level of actually being able to get on medication and have the surgery, that's like at the final end. That's like at the end. And once they get to that end, they have to be on a cycle of non-deployable. And pretty much every military person goes through that cycle, other than special forces, whose cycle is a lot faster. So for lack of better terms, and because I don't feel good, let's just say we got regular military and we got non-regular military. Special forces is what we're going to call them. So non-regular military probably deploys maybe once every other year, right? So then they have 12 months where they are in a non-deployable status. So within that 12 months, then that is when medication and surgeries can happen. It cannot happen when they are in a deployable status. So how does one petition to have their gender assignment changed? Well, first they have to say, hi, I'm Ingrid and I'm now transgender. And then they have to go to mental health. And then from mental health, they have to go through testing and counseling. And then from there, their packet has to go to either big Air Force, big Navy, or big Army. And they have to go through a whole nother slew of medical testing. And then they have to be interviewed. And then their CO, their leadership has to be interviewed. So let's just say their chief, their commander, et cetera, et cetera. Then the base's overall CO has to review the packet and say, yes, this person can X, Y, and Z. And then that person has to go through another slew of testing and X, Y, and Z, and another slew of counseling. I mean, it's a process. You just can't wake up and say, hey, I'm transgender and I'm going to change my sex assignment. It don't work like that. And let's just say a male is going to female. They still have to they still have to fulfill their requirements for the military. They have to. So, as I'm stating, or as I'm trying to say, it's not an easy process. It's a very long, drawn-out process. And the process is looked at by many eyes. And it's very hard for an individual to come out and say, hey, you know, I'm really a woman, or I identify as a woman, though they look like a male. It's hard. And a lot of people don't want that pressure. I don't know anyone who would willingly put themselves in that position to have that type of pressure put on their shoulders, especially being in the military. For those that are not in the military, it's hard. People are judged by the people that they're supposed to love. They get abused from their parents. They get kicked out of the house. They get shunned. How many people would want to literally put a S on their chest, like the Scarlet Letter, and walk around town and having everyone pick on them? It's not easy. So for those that are different from us, I would say, instead of judging them, like, let's try to get to know them. Let's try to understand them. And I think the only way we can do that is by asking questions. So for chapter 7, gender identity, transgender, military, let's go into parenting. They talk about parenting, grandparenting, and siblings. So I don't think I talked about this, but I went home maybe about 2 weeks ago. My last travel, I went home. My godmother had passed away. So back in September, she had passed away, but because of a whole lot of other stuff, and I don't do funerals, I didn't go home until 2 weeks ago to her dedication. So when we're looking at families, I have to ask people to really look inside their family and identify those people who made an impact, whether it be negative or positive. So using myself as an example, I had a great foundation, and part of the reason why my foundation was so great was because my mother had help. My mother and my father had help. So there's this African proverb that says it takes a village to raise a child. Well, I was a village baby. I was most definitely a village baby. And part of my foundation came from my godparents. I had 2 godmothers, Jean and Georgia Harrell. They were sisters. And when I tell you, these ladies knew me before I was born. They knew me before I was thought of. I'm pretty sure they probably prayed about me before I was even conceived. These ladies and their families raised me, molded me, and created a hellified foundation for me. And they were a part of why I am the woman I am today. So it wasn't just my mom and my dad, it wasn't just my grandparents, but it was also that extra layer of my godparents, and then that other extra, the Johnsons. And the Johnsons were my neighbors growing up. There were a lot of hands in that pot when I came about and when my siblings came about. And I think that that is one of the things that people are missing. I'm going into my opinion. Let me back up. I think that is one of the things that we need to realize is that it takes multiple people, multiple influences into raising children. And so my question to you is, who helped raise you? Other than your mom, other than your dad, other than your siblings, who else was there that you looked up to as a family, as a parental guidance? Who gave you that parental guidance? Who was that other mother, that other auntie? In the African American culture, we have what is called fictive kin, or play sisters, play mama, play daddy. That's my auntie, that's my sis. And when you ask them like, oh, that's your blood sister, we like, no, see, that's a friend of a friend of a. So my question to you is, who helped raise you? And for those who have children, who are those fictive kin members that are in your children's lives? Great example. I have 3 best friends, and all 3 of my best friends have children. And so when the children see me, they say TT Ingrid. And so one of my best friend, Jay, when her kids got older, I remember her oldest daughter looking at me saying, she was looking at me and she was looking at my mom, and she said, that's your mom? And I said, yes. She said, well, where is my mom's mom? I said, well, your mom's mom has passed away. And she said, well, if you guys don't share moms and if you don't share dads, then how are you my aunt? And so we all laughed, and I don't know how we explained it to her, but we did. But from that point on, I'm still Auntie Ingrid. I'm still TT Ingrid. That's just what it is. So the question is, who helped raise you, or who is helping raise your children? And what are those influence on your children? So we've talked about that. Also in chapter 7, it talks about daycare and child protective services. So I have a thing about daycare. Daycare can be a beautiful place. It can be a scary place. But most definitely it needs to be a place where you feel comfortable, because a lot of things can happen in daycare to your children, which is where child protective services comes in. I will be honest and tell you that I don't work with children. That's my no population. I was a 3rd grade teacher once, and after that experience, I said I will never work with children again. Not because of the children, but because of the parents, and also because of child protective services. So for those that don't know, child protective services has this thing where they pretty much believe in reunification at all costs, and that is something that I do not agree with. I do not agree that all parents need to be reunited. Everything needs to be exhausted before a child is taken away from their parents. I don't believe in that. And I've seen it on numerous occasions where children have been sent back to the same abuser that they were taken away from, and the abuser was never cured, if you will. And I don't even want to say the word cure, but rehabilitated. But I have a whole thing. I'm not going to jump down that rabbit hole about child protective services, but child protective services was made or put in place to help children, just like adult protective services was put in place to help adults who were either had issues with capacity or could not advocate for themselves. Chapter 8. Chapter 8 talks about some things. Some of the things that I'm going to go over is learning, ADHD, anxiety disorders, peer groups, and alternative families. So In chapter 8, it talks about learning when it comes to children, or development in middle childhood. I think children need to most definitely have access to as much education as possible during middle childhood. And it's just not book knowledge, but exposure. One of the things about me is that we were poor. We were poor. But we didn't know we were poor based off of the things that we had access to do. I remember going to camp, and my mother looked for every scholarship that she could have found to send me to this camp. And so that's how I was able to go to camp every year. I was either the scholarship kid or it was some free city camp that I went to. But all of that allowed me exposure. I got to go to the zoo. I got to go rappelling, kayaking, hiking, camping in the woods. I got to be exposed to a whole lot of things that weren't necessarily in a book, but helped me learn and helped me grow. One thing that I also noticed was during the 80s, ADHD, I want to say not in the 80s, but the 90s and 2000s, ADHD became a big thing. And I remember a lot of my classmates starting to be diagnosed with this diagnosis. And at the time, they were saying that it was because of drug babies. Which is not the correct term, and I apologize. I'm not here to offend. But because of babies that were exposed to drugs while they were in the fetus, one of the outcomes was ADHD. So I remember that specifically, and then I also remembered as I grew older, I went to college, I want to say grad school, when I was at Howard, a lot of people started having issues with the diagnosis of ADHD, saying that it was that a lot of African Americans, especially African American boys, were given this title because they appeared to be hyperactive. So is it a justifiable diagnosis? Yes. Can it be misused? Of course. And if you would do a quick Google search on ADHD and African American males, or young African American males, you can see the correlation and the controversy around it. Anxiety disorders. A lot of children also have been diagnosed with anxiety disorders. Some of it correlates to being predisposed to violent crimes. Also, drugs as an infant or a child, or being in a mother's stomach, and things of that nature. So having social or traumas, that's what I'm trying to grasp, traumas. So having issues, or children that were exposed to traumatic issues, having anxieties or disorders for anxiety. Chapter 8 also talks about peer groups. Peer groups are big in middle childhood learning or growing. Peer groups can sway you to do a whole lot of stuff. I remember for myself, peer groups, I remember bullying. I remember ganging up on certain kids because of certain things. I remember different kids sectioning off in different groups. Like in middle school, if you would walk into my middle school library, you can see the different cliques. So peer groups are most definitely important when it comes to development in childhood. Alternative families, that could go back to chapter 7 when it comes to fictive kin, like play cousins, play sisters, and things of that nature. 9 is adolescence. So chapter 9, I'm looking for it in the book. So when I read chapter 9, it took me back to middle school, high school. And I can tell you that those were times in which I wish I could just like erase those times in my mind. Those were like some of the most cringe-worthy times in my life. I was so awkward and weird. I had no understanding of who I was or what I wanted to do with my life or any of that. And my peer groups were no better. So growing up, I was a part of this program called the DSEG program in Missouri. And what it did was it bussed out kids who lived in the inner city to the suburbs. Oh, excuse me. So when we got bussed out, it was like black and white from what we were used to. I went to one of the richest school districts in Missouri. I went to one of the richest, it was probably top 5 in public schools, one of the best high schools or best school districts, public education school districts within the city. Top 5 in Missouri, top, I want to say 25 in the nation. So I went to a really good school district. And so it was very weird because growing up in my classes, I was one of a handful of black people. We most definitely didn't have the money that some of my peers had. So it was an eye-opening experience, and I was exposed to a lot of things. I was exposed to drugs, and this was a different type of drug. This wasn't crack. In my neighborhood, we had crack. This wasn't it. This was pill popping. I was exposed to suicide at a very, very early age. In middle school, I want to say about every year someone hung themselves. And I remember it started off with a girl who was adopted from another country, I want to say Asia. And she hung herself off the banister of her adopted parents' home. I experienced being a runaway. Like kids was like cussing their parents out and just hopping in the Benz and driving away. The crimes were very different from what I was used to. People didn't knuckle up and fight like they did in my neighborhood. They did very malicious things like slipping pills in people's drinks and sexually assaulting people. That's what I remember about high school. So that world was completely different from my neighborhood. And so in my neighborhood, we had crack. We didn't pop pills. Violence was you knuckled up and you fought somebody. If you had beef, you fought them. You didn't slip a Mickey in nobody's drink. Violence was different. I think we didn't really see violence and crime because maybe we were just immune to it. But we didn't necessarily participate in that because we knew better. Like we had gangs, and if you went to high school, that wasn't what you did. That was normally for the kids who dropped out. So I had a very different view of the world. And one of the things that I think about is the movie The Hate You Live that is out now. Like, I will never go see that movie. And one of the reasons why I will never see that movie is because it's too much like what I went through. And I believe that I mean, I get triggered just watching the little um the little reviews on television. It triggers me and I be crying and I have flashbacks. So just think of me sitting through that movie and watching it. I'd be an emotional wreck. But that little girl, how she went to a private school in the daytime, but her home life was very, very different. That is how I was raised. So one of the things that I want you to think about is, how did your adolescent life and your peer groups, how did that mold you? I can tell you for myself, it molded me because I understand both worlds. I understand living in the hood and being poor, but I also understand what it's like to have money and having access to stuff, whatever you can think of, knowing people who had access. And because I knew those people who had access, I kind of had access in a way. I had access because they had access. How it molded me was, I understood the value of my education. I understood that the education that I had could take me so far. It took me, coming from that high school took me to where I am now. If I were to go back to the city of St. Louis and apply for a job and put my high school down, I would get an interview just based off of the high school's name. If I said I went to this high school, people would look at me twice. I remember, matter of fact, I went home and I was home for a couple of months in between contracts. And to get some extra money, I drove Uber. So I remember going into the county in which I was in high school with, and a guy gets in, and you do that talk, that whatever you call that talk. And he asked me why I knew that area so well. And I said, because I went to high school up the street. And he said, no, you didn't. I said, yes, I did. I said, matter of fact, if you go in that high school and walk down such and such a hallway, you will see my whole family. You will see 2 out of 3 of my brothers. You will see my name and stuff on the plaques on the wall, because we were athletes. And I started name dropping about the people who went and what the high school used to look like before the remodeling and everything. And so the guy looked at me and he said, wow, you really did go to that high school. And I said, yes, I did. So I realized that my education and where I came from, as far as my education, it was important. And I used that to be able to make the steps that I made. Another way that my adolescence molded me is that I simply don't take no crap. My crap meter is very, very low. And the reason why I say that is because I've been called everything. I've been called everything under the book. People have had no expectation for me. When I can tell you in elementary school, I had teachers who told me that that I wasn't going to be able to amount to anything. So when it comes to people insulting me, I'm like a duck. It goes off my back. But because of that, I also know my worth, and I don't go back and forth with people. This is my worth, and this is what it is. I have very thick skin, and I'm very ambitious. So those are some of the characteristics that I got from being an adolescent. I can go anywhere. I can talk to anyone. I'm not afraid. I have sat at dinner tables with people who have more money than I could ever think of, and I was not afraid or intimidated or scared or anxious or nervous. I have sat in the same room with convicted sex killers and murderers, and I have not been intimidated, but been there in a way of understanding. Um, so yeah, that's what I want you guys to talk about for your discussion board, is how did your adolescence mold you? So that's all I got. I'm probably going to redo this video because I feel like I went everywhere. And I don't know how much sense it made. I apologize. But this is what I have for right now. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, most definitely text me or hit me up with a message, and I'll get back to you. Thanks.